Our metabolism doesn't have speeds. It has efficiency and inefficiency. When we are a fat burner, a good fat burner, a healthy metabolism, it can efficiently switch. So we can easily switch from burning sugar to burning fat if we have a healthy metabolism. And we do this seamlessly. And it's not just the fat in our food that we're burning, but it's our body fat.
Dr. Cate Shanahan, welcome to the Keto Camp podcast.
Thank you so much for having me on, Ben. Great to be here.
I'm excited. I loved your work. I just said before we hit record that if you don't have deep nutrition and you're in the health space, you're doing it wrong. So we'll get into your book. We'll get into all your books, especially the most recent one. And before we do, I want you to please share your story with my audience and what got you involved in the health space. And then how did you go from the conventional approach to what you're doing now?
Yeah. So my story was a sad story because I tell you, I had so much hope for medicine that I was going to learn the underlying root cause of my passion was sports injuries and, recurring soft tissue injuries, because I was an athlete and I kept getting injured. And after going through medical school, I realized that was a total pipe dream, and I had to settle for, I thought the most interesting specialty would be the puzzle solving specialty of family medicine and primary care, because we have the whole age range. We have to help out the specialists by, really making the diagnosis and sending, our patients with complicated issues to the right specialist. So I thought that was going to be like really the cool part about what I did. As I graduated, I became more and more disillusioned about the non-mysteries, right? The stuff where it was hypertension and diabetes and all the cookie cutter chronic disease cases where we just wrote prescriptions and had people keep coming back for refills. That was so depressing to me. And so my outlet was exercise. And then that was taken away because while I was living in Hawaii, this was about 4 years after I graduated, I got this mysterious problem with my right knee where I had this constant pain. It would swell. I started getting fevers, and nothing helped me. I had surgeries. I saw multiple specialists. I got injections. I even saw a kahuna because I was in Hawaii and was like, well, this is the Grand Central Station of kahunas, so better see one. And that didn't help either. And finally, I had to resort to taking my husband's advice. It was the hardest thing I've ever had to do. Admit that he might be right, that my sugar habit was probably not healthy. I had a horrible sugar addiction, and I would literally add a quarter cup of sugar to my coffee in the form of this caramel sauce. And so in learning about nutrition, which I did because he gave me a book that Andrew Weil wrote. So Andrew Weil is kind of like the founding father of alternative medicine. He's now kind of Mr. Supplement, but he's very well respected. And he wrote a book called Spontaneous Healing. And in there he mentioned a term, essential fatty acid, that I did not learn in medical school. And I thought I had learned everything about fats that there was to learn. And so having had a real interest in biochemistry previous to medical school, I actually was in Cornell studying biochemistry. Just like the fact that these things were omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acids, I was just like, wow, that sounds so fascinating. So I actually reread my entire chemistry book and took a deep dive down into the science of fats and realized that my problem with my health was that I was eating nothing like the kind of diet that the human body was designed for. And so I overhauled my diet. I overhauled the way I practiced medicine. So like I kind of solved two problems at once. It was my knee. I got better. I was able to hike and bike and everything. And I started really enjoying my medical practice, and I was able to get people off medications. And it was a real thrill. It was like, finally, this was the underlying thing that I was looking for, that I had hoped for when I was, going through medical school.
And some of your initial research, you look back at some of the old cookbooks and you got some inspiration and kind of ideas of what we actually used to eat and how it actually was real foods. Talk a little bit more about those cookbooks.
I'm so glad you brought those up, because those are the best nutrition science resources that we have available to us, and we have hundreds of them. The problem, I'm sure your listeners have heard other guests talk about this. The problems with our health started in the 1950s, when we kind of went off the deep end with technology, better living through chemistry, and listened to this one dude named Ansel Keys, who was trying to tell us that heart disease is caused by saturated fat. All just wrong-headed ideas, and born of like extreme arrogance. The guy himself was known to be a bully, and his friends called him arrogant. So not a nice guy, but he convinced the American Heart Association leadership that they should go down this angle of sponsorship from industry. And that was kind of the beginning of the air quotes nutrition science, or the fake news nutrition science that doctors pay good money to be brainwashed into when we go to medical school. And the end of real nutrition science, which was something that had been passed down through generations, and really was handled by mothers. It's kind of a softer science. We thought of it that way anyway. We thought of like the culinary arts and just like mom's cooking. Actually, we didn't even think of them as sciences, but they truly were the original nutrition science, because encoded in the short format of a traditional recipe is so much essential nutrition knowledge. And what my husband and I did when we wrote our first book, Deep Nutrition, was pose the question, hey, people everywhere, when you look at travel shows, you see recurring themes. You see people using chicken, pigs, and grazing animals, and whatever vegetables are in their environment, whatever they can catch out of the water. There's a recurring theme here. So people think the same way around the world, and we use the same tools. Could it be that we all needed the same kind of diet? And so we pose the question, is there anything that all of these traditional cooking techniques and cooking recipes and travel show in the traditional cooking of wherever they're going to have in common? And we found out that there definitely was. And it wasn't so much ingredients per se, or macros or anything like that. It was simple strategies of, that's how we defined it. It's a strategy of extracting the maximum nutrition from your landscape, specifically the edible parts of your landscape, right? Like not, not bark and dirt, but the living part of the edible landscape. And so that's what deep nutrition really is about, is just, those reproducing real nutrition science the way it always had been before people like Ansel Keys came along and formal education, and before we convinced ourselves that because we used long sciencey terms, macronutrients and saturated fat, that was a more valid definition of diet than fresh fish poached and fermented.
So you came across this truth. It is a truth. This is the way we were designed to live and thrive, is to consume real food, saturated fats, these stable fats. And then you had a decision to make, which was, okay, do I do a 180 here? Now, do I go back to my practice and start teaching my patients to have more saturated fats? Like, what kind of resistance did you experience when you started to do that?
Oh, resistance from every possible corner, because there's so many barriers in place, right? For one thing, just the demands on my time, right? Like, so I started giving talks to kind of help people understand, there's some powerful information here. And please, read the books that I wrote, right? And this was 2008, 2009, and we were on Hawaii, and the world was not as connected back then. We self-published our book. There were not like a lot of podcasts. There were like 4. There was no way to publicize it. So we just went out in public. And then I developed like this reputation for being knowledgeable about nutrition, which was that would you think that was a good thing, but it was a problem because people wanted to talk to me for more than the 15 minutes that my boss, who owned the practice, wanted me to schedule, right? So it became this huge stress because people would come down an hour away from the other side of the island, and they'd have like a zillion questions that they wrote down, and I was like, well, I'm sorry, I have other people waiting. And, I had no way to manage it. And I wasn't the entrepreneur that could just be like, okay, well, I'm going to start my own practice or something. I had no solution for it working in the standard medical practice. But I thought there was a solution. So what happened was I started looking around for, well, maybe the problem is I'm on the island of Hawaii, and I just, maybe there's a better way to practice. Maybe there's another medical system. Maybe. So somebody was recruiting from New Hampshire, and they said, well, we're creating this new clinic called Family Health and Wellness, and we love your website and that you're really into wellness. And they convinced me that life was going to be different over there. So I flew out there, great interview. We relocated from Hawaii all the way to New Hampshire. And that was the same thing. I was such an idiot to think it was going to be any different. It was the same thing because the medical system was the problem. It wasn't my particular boss or the particular hospital system I was in. It was the medical system. So finally, I learned that lesson and tried to start on my own. But at the same time, I got a book deal. So I really couldn't do both. So I just got sucked back into the system again. And then finally, now my current job. So this is the ultimate out. And this is the only solution that there is for medical doctors who understand nutrition and aren't entrepreneurs. You want to work for a company directly, like the way that actually, ironically, on Hawaii, they had plantation doctors. And the job of that doctor was to keep the patients or keep the workers as healthy as possible, whatever it took. So, if it took spending an hour with some people, didn't matter because your income wasn't based on repeatedly, churning through people as fast as possible. So that's really the only solution that makes any sense to me, right? Not being an entrepreneur, not being like able to figure out, well, how can I sell classes and, other things and have product lines? And I just think it's beyond me.
Right. Yeah. Well, that's a great solution. And I love that you're doing that now with this company that you're working with. So you skipped something there in your journey, which I wanted to talk about. You worked for the Lakers, and
yeah.
I was actually surprised because nutritional science is pretty backwards these days, and I was surprised they would hire somebody like you who's actually caught up with the research. So how did you get that gig, and then what was it like being one of the nutritionists for the Lakers?
Yeah, no one was more surprised than me, and in fact, the Lakers themselves were shocked. They were surprised. So, the only reason that we got together, the Lakers and I, is because, 2 people, my husband and Gary Vitti. So my husband just had the idea that it would be great for us, for my brand, and for sports in general, if there was a radical overhaul of the way they did nutrition science. And it was like a miracle that Gary Vitti and his assistant Tim DeFrancesco were on the one of the 2 teams he called. He called the Miami Dolphins and he called the LA Lakers, and they both called him back. But the LA Lakers had Gary Vitti and Tim DeFrancesco, and Gary Vitti was from an Italian traditional background upbringing where his dad like always had a garden and like made his own beef stock and chicken stock and ate every part of the animal and all that kind of stuff. So when he read Deep Nutrition, Gary, it resonated with him because at the time his dad was like in his 90s and still living totally independently, had all of his faculties about him, and it's kind of a rare thing. And then Tim DeFrancesco had grown up in Vermont, and like the whole barefoot hippie thing and fresh raw milk, lots of fermented milk, fermenting milk into cheese, stuff like that. So it all made sense to both of them. And then we were also lucky that we had the chef there who is still there, Sandra Padilla, is still there making fantastic food. She grew up in a traditional Mexican household where she was one of 9 girls, believe it or not. And like she was cooking her whole life. And so everything that I wanted to happen could happen because she grew up doing it, and she just hadn't kind of been really able to have like the full reign to do what she wanted to do there. And it was just a wonderful opportunity for her as well. We just told her to go for it. Like with, you know, you like making different types of stock, do it. You like using different fats, bringing in different fresh foods. And I mean, she was just like a master of everything. And her food is like so good. Like when people would go from the Lakers to other teams, they would come back to the Lakers and they would make sure to tell Sandra that they didn't know how good they had it the first time they were with the Lakers, because hers is probably the best in the NBA, which is saying a lot because
Wow.
they have good chefs.
I love that story of her having 9 siblings, 8 other sisters, and her being the chef for the Lakers. That's super cool. So what were some of the things that you started to implement for the Los Angeles Lakers, and what are some of the improvements you saw, if you could share, with the athletes?
So one of the things that was like brought in the most like attention, the most media attention, was what we did with bone broth. So there were points in time where the players would get injured, and that was an opportunity where we could use the natural healing properties of bone broth to help reduce inflammation and get them back on the court as soon as possible. So famously, Kobe sprained his ankle, right? Somewhere around April of, I forget which season it was. And he said it was like the second worst sprain of his life. And so I got on the phone, it was like 2 a.m. or something, and said, hey, can you get some soup, some of the chicken soup that I had made? I had them make sure to have on hand for the entire team. Can you deliver it to Kobe? And, you know, we'll then I had to talk to Kobe, and I was like, do you want this stuff? And he was like, yes. So he was totally on board with all the natural healing methods. And he actually, after that ankle injury, recovered within less than 2 weeks. And
Wow.
that was the second worst sprain of his life. So normally you're out for 6 weeks. So he was able to come back. And like those kinds of stories got a lot of play with the media, who are also interested in what we were doing. What was this crazy doctor, and what kind of crazy foods are the Lakers eating? And so that really, I think, had something to do with the whole like bone broth craze, because we did get a lot of press, and then, you know, even subsequently perhaps the supplements, you know, around collagen and stuff like that. So, you know, I think it really, really helped raise awareness of like this missing food group, because that's literally what it is. Like all the glycosaminoglycans and proteoglycans that you get that have this ability to act like a hormone and help your skin, hair, nails, ligaments, your gut, all this kind of stuff. So that's one of the biggest, that was like the flashiest thing. And then the perhaps most important thing that's very not flashy, that almost nobody was talking about, but in my mind was, you know, super important, was to get them off the killer, that what I call the Hateful Eight seed oils.
Yeah, you talk about it here in your book, the fat burn fix that I'm holding up here.
Yeah, because those things are completely incompatible with athletic performance. They promote inflammation. The inflammation saps your energy. It damages your joints. It makes you feel tired. So they're like the opposite of what an athlete needs. So that was a big part of my job, was actually calling ahead to all the hotel chefs and finding out, okay, so what is it on the menu that they can actually order? And then making sure that the guys that were invested in their health knew what to order and what to avoid from the in-room dining menus.
So what are the Hateful Eights? Let's get into this.
So these are high polyunsaturated fatty acid oils. And I can explain what polyunsaturated fatty acid is, but mostly what you need to know is the names of the oils. So there's 3 C's and 3 S's that you have to look for when you're grocery shopping. So that's corn, canola, cottonseed, soy, sunflower, safflower. And then when you're in the restaurants and even fine dining, like either 5-star hotels that the Lakers would stay at, there's rice bran and grapeseed oil. And so that's the 8 of them. And why they're bad for us is because they are too high in these unstable fatty acids. That's the category called polyunsaturated fatty acids. And that's the kind that Ansel Keys is telling people that we need to eat more of, and carrying on his legacy of horror in places like Tufts and Harvard. We have, the figureheads at these Ivy League institutions sending the same message out that we need to eat more of these polyunsaturated fatty acids. And they're just horrible for us for so many reasons. It would take an entire series of podcasts just to cover it properly. But the short story is they damage your mitochondria and they promote inflammation. And, they are incompatible with health. Yet we are getting the average person who doesn't know to avoid these things, even if they're kind of a health nut, is probably getting somewhere between 30 and 50% of their total daily calories from these things, and like 80% of their fat calories from these things.
That is alarming, because the body has no use for it, right? They get stuck around the cell membrane. They create inflammation around the cell membrane, and all of a sudden this bodyguard, which is the cell membrane, starts to get inflamed and send signals to the DNA, creating disease. So I want to get into it because I talk a lot about the vegetable oils. I interviewed a gentleman named Bryant. I don't know if you're familiar with his work, but he wrote a great book. I think you'd totally geek out with him. It's called the PEO Solution. So he talks a lot about vegetable oils, about these unstable fats. And I interviewed him in person here in Miami. And I said, Professor Peskin, what's worse, smoking cigarettes or these vegetable oils? And I know you've had this conversation before with Dave Asprey and others. And according to his research, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on his research according to the stats here, he said if somebody smoked 2 packs of cigarettes every single day for about 28 years, their chances of developing lung cancer is about 16%, according to his research. And then he said if somebody ate these cooked vegetable oils, these toxic 8, hateful 8, for every single day for up to 28 years, their chances of developing a cancer and or heart disease was about 86%. So how does that line up with your research?
Yeah, I would say it's probably close. If you include other diseases that you don't want, like Alzheimer's and autoimmune diseases, we're approaching 100, because without these seed oils, we would not have the burden of chronic disease that we do, because now, as opposed to 100 years ago, we know about things like vitamins and minerals, right? And so we were healthier 100 years ago, and we didn't have a clue about vitamins or minerals or polyunsaturated fatty acids or anything, right? So like, I would think that if you put together the ability to quantify the nutrients that we need and just the ability to avoid this toxic thing, that you could pretty much make yourself cancer proof, pretty close, heart attack proof, autoimmune disorder proof, and Alzheimer's proof, that covers a lot of ground, right? So, I mean, my thing is that these things are responsible for at least 95% of what primary care doctors are doing every day. And, about that much in terms of healthcare expenditures, which are in the trillions of dollars.
Yeah, well, that's alarming. Almost 100% of disease. I know about these oils because of your work and, of course, Dr. Pompa's work and Brian Peskin. And when I go to restaurants, I drive the waiters and waitresses crazy because I'm always asking the questions. What do you cook your food with? It's always going to be a soybean or some sort of olive oil blend, which has soybean. So I tell them I'm allergic. My girlfriend's allergic. Can we have something else like butter? And, most of the time they do it. But we got to do that to eliminate those hits. And our body will heal, like Dr. Shanahan just explained. But I want to talk more about these because in your book, The Fat Burn Fix, which everybody has to go get this book either on Audible or the physical copy. I actually have both. I listen to it and I read it. It's so good. You talk about the Great Exchange, how in the history of nutrition, there was the Great Exchange that happened there that resulted in what we're dealing with today. So talk about this Great Exchange.
Yes, well, thank you for saying that. So Yeah, the actually I don't remember what is the great exchange. That's me. I say that.
Yeah, yeah, you said it in your
That's
book.
a good
So,
term.
so we took these saturated fats that we were
Oh
eating,
yeah.
and then we
Okay.
you kind of already touched upon it, but I want you to talk a little bit more how we
I
exchanged
just
them
want to
for
make
these
sure.
PUFAs. That's
Yes,
yeah,
absolutely. Yes,
yeah.
absolutely. So, right. I mean, that's really what we did is we were having the bulk of our fat calories come from saturated and monounsaturated, and now we have a tiny minority of our fat calories coming from the saturated monounsaturated, and it's all PUFA. And what you said earlier is so important is that after a certain point our body has nothing to do with them, and that issue about the certain point is such a confusing and like it's how the dietitians get it all wrong, right? Like the dietitians who aren't like haven't been awakened, right? Like you and I, we've been sort of awakened, right? There are dietitians who have been awakened as well, but the standard thinking is that people who are saying what we are saying, we just don't understand how saturated fat just clogs your arteries and is pro-inflammatory, right? That's the standard thinking. Because we don't understand how you need these polyunsaturated fatty acids, and if you don't get them, you're going to die. And so that's true to an extent, right? We need something like 2% of our total daily calories to come from omega-3 and omega-6, and probably an equal quantity or maybe slightly more omega-3 than omega-6.
Oh, really? You think we need more omega-3 than omega-6?
Well, I think we do. And if you want to talk about that, that's an interesting sidebar, sure, that we definitely can have. But the great exchange, and I can't believe I came up with that term and then forgot about it. But you're like in a different zone when you're writing.
Totally. I'll remind you. I'll be the person to remind you.
Thank you. Yes, that exchange is just like the deadly thing that opened the door to chronic disease, and here we are. Because once you exceed that 2%, maybe 4%, now your body, but you continue to consume PUFAs. Your body has nowhere to put them, so they have to end up in your body fat, right? Your cells are pretty much control freaks, and to the extent that they can, they try to limit the amount that's going to go into their membranes and inside them. There's a point at which they can't really limit it or they can't control it. But so for the most part, it's going to have to end up in your body fat, and that includes visceral fat. So we have a lot of people, who are on the skinny side, but they have this central obesity, and that's because when you have so much PUFA in your diet, your body can't even traffic it properly, and it doesn't want to go in your body fat, so it kind of just stays in the first place that it lands in your body, which is in the fat lining your intestines, called the visceral fat. So yes, so that great exchange is what opened up the door to all chronic diseases, and all you have to do is reverse that. Like who was that, Willy Wonka in the chocolate factory says, scratch that, reverse it, and start eating much more of the monounsaturated fatty acids, and just clear your life of the PUFAs and the seed oils, because you're going to get enough of the polyunsaturated fatty acids from whole foods, as long as you have like any kind of nuts and seeds in your diet, or if you want to do like a carnivore diet, if you get fish and wild fish and properly raised animals in your diet.
There's so much I want to talk about with you, and I'm going to be disciplined and keep it on course with what we're saying here. I just did 40 days of carnivore, by the way, and my C-reactive protein, amongst other inflammatory markers, all dropped. I went 1.1 on day 1 of carnivore to 0.5 on day 40 of
Wow.
nothing but animal fat and saturated fat, and I did a whole panel. But anyways, that just goes to show that we are actually designed to eat these stable saturated fats that are delicious too. So why not eat them? You mentioned that you believe we need about a 1-to-1 or even a higher omega-3 than omega-6 ratio in our diet.
Yes. That's because the omega-3 saturated fatty acids are more unstable than the omega-6. And so even on a healthy diet, they're more likely to kind of get damaged in the process of cooking, or,
Mm.
just have some kind of a stray free radical kind of damage them and take them out, right? So in order for the amount that's ultimately absorbed into your body to be equal, we need a little bit more of omega-3 sources in the food that we eat, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's
If we
interesting.
cook, right?
So,
Especially if we cook.
so if we're consuming unadulterated, healthy, stable fats, which include omega-6 and omega-3, out of those two, omega-6 and omega-3 is more unstable than the omega-6. So to make up that difference, we consume more omega-3 to make up the difference. Did I get that right?
Exactly so.
Okay, interesting. Okay. And the cell membrane, I talk about this often. The cell membrane is what I think 28 to 33% omega-6, correct? Something around there.
It's hard to know, because you would have to look at people who are on a completely healthy wild diet, right? So how are we really going to find, you would have to do that research on like something like the Hadza or the Maasai, but 40 years ago, because now even these traditional people have had their diets adulterated, so it's like, how are you going to find out what's your control? You have to do like comparative zoology or something like that, right? It's hard to know.
Yeah.
I don't mean to be evasive, but it's
No, that's a good
it's hard
point.
to know.
Yeah, you're right. With all the stuff we're eating right now, it's hard to actually know what we're actually designed to have in percentages.
I wanted to bring up something though, Ben, before we leave the topic, because on this issue of omega-3 being so fragile, even more fragile than omega-6. You can't just supplement more omega-3 and get enough omega-3 in your body if you've been eating a standard American diet. You have to cut out the omega-6, because it's kind of like herd immunity, right? We're all now we're trying to achieve herd immunity, so that those people who are never infected don't have to worry so much if they're like fragile, like the over 85, the elderly population. You get 70% of the population immune, so that people who have never been exposed are less likely to be exposed. So it's kind of like that with free radicals in your body, right? So we have so much omega-6 and omega-3 in our body, but mostly it's omega-6, that there's so much tendency to inflammation and free radicals. If we just eat, a whole bunch of omega-3, it gets destroyed. It cannot, our liver, we don't have the antioxidants, so it just doesn't quite make it into our body tissues. What we have to do is cut out this omega-6. And there's been studies that show that if you cut out omega-6 without increasing your intake of omega-3, your blood levels of omega-3 start to rise. Because what little you've been getting stops being destroyed so fast. So it's very complicated, this whole issue of oxidation science. It's very complicated, and there's a lot to consider. And so that's why I had to write the Fat Burn Fix, basically focusing on the effects of vegetable oil on your metabolism and your body's ability to generate energy only. Because like I said, you could do a whole series of courses on what the heck has happened to our health because of vegetable oil.
Yeah, and a lot of people don't distinguish between adulterated omega-6 and unadulterated omega-6. So
Right.
when you're saying reduce your omega-6, you're talking about the adulterated, unstable omega-6s.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, it's very important, and it's hard to get way too much if you're not consuming these seed oils.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. You're right. And then this brings me to the point of fish oil. Fish oil, if we look at it from a biochemistry standpoint, which you do so brilliantly, isn't fish oil an unstable fat as well?
Highly, it is the most unstable, right? Because the stability comes from the number of double bonds that are located close to each other, and they're called conjugated double bonds. So and what that does is that sort of attracts oxygen. When you have two double bonds very close to each other, it attracts oxygen, and oxygen is an aggressive molecule. It attacks the bond and destroys the molecule. And so if you have two double bonds next to each other compared to just one all by itself, the oxygen is like something like 9 billion times more likely to attack, right? And so if you have 3 double bonds in a row, then you're just magnifying it beyond like normal numbers that we even have words for. And the fish oils, they have the longest one of the fish oils, I think, has like 5 double bonds.
Wow.
All very close to each other. So there's basically, that thing is so unstable that it rarely makes it off the shelf before just being gone. Yeah. And it doesn't just politely disappear and evaporate. It actually very often will turn into somewhat toxic compounds. So this is a serious issue. I mean, we have people who are consuming fish oils and they're actually getting some toxic compounds if it's a low quality, especially if it's a low quality fish or cod liver oil. And they've done studies on that as well. And I cite some of them in Deep Nutrition.
Yeah, you do. And, this is a topic that not a lot of people talk about. There are still very brilliant people in our space promoting fish oil. They're taking fish oil themselves. And the research that I looked at showed that 83% of fish oil is rancid on the shelf before we even consume it or purchase it. And then going back to Bryant Peskin, he has an Iowa study that showed when we removed these fish oils from patients, their cell membrane inflammatory levels went back toward normal level after 132 days. It took them about 5 months to go back to a healthier range. And then when they gave them the fish oils again, their inflammatory markers went back up, and then they removed it 132 days. So it was just crazy to see that. When I came across the research, I thought, oh, I need to stop taking fish oil and stop recommending it to people because it's clearly not helping me or those I'm educating. So I immediately stopped taking it. So it's not a very popular stance, but it's the truth here. Okay. You talked about on a podcast, I think it was with my friend Abel James. You did a great podcast with him. It might've been his show. You talked about the number one thing to do to reduce our risk of COVID-19 coronavirus is to remove these seed oils. And you looked at the research in Brazil and you came across some astonishing stats. So could you share about that?
Yes. So wait, what was I talking about? Research in Brazil.
Yeah, I could spark your memory here. You talked about Brazil consumes the most soybean oil and they have the most coronavirus.
Right. Oh, right. Okay. Yes. Thank you. Oh my gosh, time flies. That was like a month ago. Yeah. So of all the South American countries, they lead the way in the consumption of the seed oils. And as the coronavirus epidemic was unfolding, I kept waiting I was looking at the global, case counts, and I kept waiting for it to show up in South America. And for whatever reason, it was resisting showing up in South America. And it does turn out that the country that consumes the most soy oil is Brazil. And they are, at least at the time where I did that research, they were the country that was by far and away leading in the deaths. Not just cases, but also deaths from coronavirus. And I did some similar investigation with countries around the world, and in Africa, the whole continent of Africa. And I looked at the 4 or 5 most infrastructurally developed there, so that their statistics on coronavirus would be the most reliable, right? So because they're thinking there's possibly a lot of underreporting. But I looked at what are the oils that they consume and where do the seed oils rank. And so the countries that had the worst coronavirus had the relatively higher consumption of the seed oils, whether it was corn or soy. Those are 2 big ones in the continent of Africa. And the countries that were consuming more in Africa is where peanut oil, I think, actually originated from. They call it ground nut oil because it tastes like a nut, but it doesn't grow on a tree like other nuts. So they were really high in consumption of both peanut oil and coconut oil, and they had a lot less coronavirus deaths. And the connection here, so what is the connection? Why is this not just some crazy coincidence? Well, the connection is inflammation. Coronavirus is a fairly modest virus when you compare in terms of its aggressiveness, when you compare it to things like dengue, or to infections. It's a modest infection compared to things like the bubonic plague, or another like the meningococcus bacteria that can kill people within 48 hours, right? So the coronavirus is slow, but the way it's killing us is by activating our immune system and making our own inflammatory processes work against us, so that the virus gets to continue to divide and divide and divide in our body, even as our health deteriorates. And so when people are dying from the coronavirus, it's nothing at all like when they die, when you have deaths from dengue fever, where the virus just takes over your body. It's the inflammatory responses. It's the inflammation in your lungs that's making fluid accumulate in your lungs, and eventually you just can't breathe, even if you're on a ventilator. And it's the inflammation in the bloodstream that's causing this thing they're calling cytokine storm, which leads to just out of control inflammation throughout the whole body, where you start to get blood clots, you get fluid seeping out of the veins, and just the body cannot maintain homeostasis, and it's deadly also. But it's triggered by our own inflammatory response. And that's the connection between the consumption of soy oils and corn oil in South America, in the United States, around the world, and who's dying from the coronavirus. Because I would stake my reputation on this, and I said this on a national HBO show, Real Time with Bill Maher. I said, you show me one person who's been avoiding these seed oils for 5 years, and they don't also have like Lyme disease or some other serious immune issue, who had a serious case of the corona where they were in the intensive care unit, and I'm wrong. One person, you've proved me wrong, but nobody. I've heard not a peep.
I'm aligned with you. Totally. I believe that. And just another reason to avoid these unstable fats. We live in a unique world, 2020. I call it the character building year of 2020.
Yeah.
So you had mentioned peanut oil. Peanut oil, from my understanding, can be one of the unstable ones, no? Or do you find, okay, so what are your thoughts on peanut oil?
So it's kind of borderline, but it is a traditional fat. So, it was traditionally used, and I believe the continent originated on was Africa, where they called it ground nut oil. And it kind of straddles the different universes between, we have the seed oils and the nut and fruit oils, right? So the nut and fruit oils, so olive oil is a fruit, coconut is actually the flesh. It's really the fruit that we're consuming. And then the nut oils like almond oil or macadamia nut oil. Those are like more traditional oils, and those are all much more stable. But peanut it's a tastes like a nut. It's as big as a nut, but it's a seed. So because it's not a tree nut, right? So it has a lot more PUFA than coconut, but not enough to be a problem. And this is really almost like a belief, right? Because I say this because it was used as a traditional cooking oil, but there's also the biochemistry that supports it too, right? So it has a lot of monounsaturated fatty acids. It does have a good amount of PUFAs, but you don't have to, the key thing here is that you don't have to process it so harshly, so that you can extract it without high heat, pressure, chemicals that destroy it to the extent that it needs refining. So basically you can do it with very simple raw materials, the way they've made it traditionally for ages and ages. The way they make olive oil is just with a simple press. Well, you can make peanut oil with a simple press too, because there's enough oil in there and it comes out easily enough that it will still retain all the antioxidants that help stabilize the relatively high, but compared to seed oils, relatively low amount of poof oil. amount of PUFA fatty acids, right? So you've got the vitamin E in there, you've got the natural antioxidants, you've got you know, a lot of the minerals and stuff that get stripped out when you refine the oil. So there is refined peanut oil, and I don't recommend that as good, but at the same time, it's not as bad as your corn and your soy oils that are all refined. So the refined peanut oil is in this unique category that I call okay. It's kind of like, how do people who can't afford the really good stuff, what can they do? Well, I'm going to tell them, go ahead and just get the peanut oil that's refined. It still has a mild peanut flavor. So even then, that tells you that it needs less refining, has a little bit more nutrition in it than the seed oils.
And you have a great chart on your website that shows kind of a breakdown of these fats, which are good, which are okay, which are bad. What's your website again?
drcate.com, drcate.com.
And we have about 8 minutes left, and I have so many more things. We got to do this again, maybe on your lake in Orlando.
All right.
Let's finish with this. There's a quote from your book, and the quote is, "It's not your genetics, it is your metabolism." And you speak about the metabolism doesn't need to speed up or slow down. This actually doesn't happen at all. And you relate this to our body fat. Could you touch upon that?
Yes. So our metabolism doesn't have speeds. It has efficiency and inefficiency. And when we are a fat burner, a good fat burner, a healthy metabolism, it can efficiently switch from burning the calories in our last meal, which often contains some sugar. And usually sugar gets priority actually for being burned so that the body doesn't have to store it. So we can easily switch from burning sugar to burning fat if we have a healthy metabolism. And we do this seamlessly. And it's not just the fat in our food that we're burning, but it's our body fat, so that we don't get hungry an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, 5 hours, 6 hours after a meal. That is an efficient metabolism. And if your metabolism is inefficient, then you have a very difficult time switching from burning the calories in your last meal, especially if it was a high carb meal, to burning your body fat. And there's all kinds of reasons for that. And one of the key ones that, you know, might sound familiar is that if you had carbs, your insulin level is high, and insulin blocks just the release of your own body fat into the bloodstream so it can be burned. So if you feel like sluggish or tired a couple hours after a meal, it's not that your metabolism is slow. It's that your metabolism is not able to use the energy in your body fat efficiently. And the key to getting healthy again isn't trying to eat 6 meals or even exercise to speed up your metabolism, although exercise is really good for you. It doesn't work by speeding up your metabolism. It works by just making you healthy so that you can, improving blood flow so that you can burn your body fat more efficiently. And that's the answer to weight gain, is getting your body so that you can burn your own body fat now. Because if you can't burn your body fat efficiently, then any diet is going to feel 10 times harder than if you can burn your body fat efficiently. And so a lot of people start to think that it's natural to think your metabolism slows down, because if it gets harder to lose weight as we age, well, everything seems to slow down as we age. So it's a natural conclusion to draw. But really what's happening is you go farther and farther down this path towards metabolic damage. And I call that the diabetes spectrum, because, if you can't burn your body fat and you have to burn sugar, that means you're sugar dependent and you have to raise your blood sugar. And that is how people develop diabetes.
You said it so well, Dr. Shanahan. And you talk about how to go from being a sugar burner who cannot burn your own body fat to burning fat and now having this metabolic freedom. So you outline all of it in your book, The Fat Burn Fix. I highly recommend everybody go pick this up either on paperback or Audible, and then go check out more of Dr. Cate's work. Where's the best place besides your website to go check you out?
So the website, drcate.com, is probably the best, but I'm also on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram, and you get the handles from my website.
Yeah, and we'll put everything in the notes of this podcast. We'll put your website, all of your social media handles, links to go purchase her book. All of
Thank
your books
you.
are fantastic. I want to acknowledge you, Dr. Cate, for being such a pioneer in the health space for so many years. I'm sure you've taken so many arrows and you stand tall, you and your husband. So this is also an acknowledgement for your husband. I appreciate your work. I've been studying you for several years now, and you've been instrumental in my education and my education to educate other people. So thank you for
Awesome.
the books that you write, the work that you're doing, and I look forward to coming up to Orlando and doing a podcast in person with you one day soon.
Oh, that'd be a blast. Thank you so much for doing what you do. Get the word out.
Let's keep doing it. Thank you, Dr. Cate.